Please note that the views expressed on this program are those of the individuals who speak them, and not necessarily those of Portsmouth Community Radio, its Board of Trustees, members, volunteers, or underwriters. Good evening and welcome to Spirit Radio. I am your host, Willie Hassell. Along with my co-host, Lynn Nickerson, we will take you on a journey into the unknown where the paranormal becomes the normal. A journey to a world cloaked in darkness where reality becomes a thin veil. So sit back, relax, and join us as we venture into the shadows, the darkness, the unknown, and back. And good evening, and welcome once again to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. I am your host, Willie Hassell, your gatekeeper to the dark side, your guide to the realm of the unknown, the unseen, the unthinkable. And she is the always lovely, she is the mystical, and she is the mysterious, Lynn Nickerson.
Good evening, Willie, and how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
Great. That's good. Glad to hear that. Mm-hmm. Nice. Did you enjoy this nice sunny day?
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, good. All right. I guess you're probably just waiting for me to go ahead and introduce our guest.
Okay, yeah, why don't we do that?
You seem to be. Okay, so tonight on Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience, we are pleased to have joining us here in the studio, Dean Merchant. And Dean is well known for developing and organizing, along with his wife Pam, the Exeter UFO Festival. 6 years running now, the festival has become one of the country's leading events on the subject of UFOs, alien encounters, and related topics, attracting some of the top speakers from around the country and around the world. Dean attended the University of Massachusetts Department of Journalism and graduated from Salem University with a degree in history. Dean has written freelance over the years for many New Hampshire newspapers. He now continues his journalism by researching the history of UFOs in New England, with specific focus on the Exeter and southern New Hampshire area. And I believe he is also in the process of writing a book. We will find out in just a minute. Good evening and welcome, Dean.
Well, thank you, Willie.
Welcome, Dean. Nice to see you.
And thank you, too, Lynn. It's nice to see you again.
So tell us, have you given that book a title yet?
I have given it a title. I'm kind of working on it as diligently as I can. And the title of the book is called They Flew East.
They Flew East?
They Flew East.
Okay.
And, it's kind of a short, but I think neat title.
I like short.
Short and neat.
Yeah.
But to the point, because what it references is the historic history of the 509th bomb wing that was in Roswell.
Oh, yeah.
They were in Roswell and were put together specifically to drop the bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were then the most elite branch of the Air Force, and they have over time continued to be so. They eventually inherited the B-2 stealth Spirit bomber, which they fly today out of Whitman Air Force Base in Missouri. But going back to the 1940s and World War II, when the atomic bomb was being developed, and they were the ones to have the delivery system for that. A couple years later, in 1947, is when we have the now famous Roswell incident that pretty much Stanton Friedman in his research made famous in the 1980s. And Roswell is interesting because I've had a chance to go back as a researcher and look at books from the 1950s onward. And you will see that Roswell really wasn't on the radar in those books until Stanton Friedman did his research and Charles Berlitz and Bill Moore did the history of that. But in any event, Roswell is an interesting and important part of modern UFO history. And people do focus on the crash at Corona that was outside of Roswell, but I've kind of looked back at Roswell itself and somewhat have discovered that Robert Goddard, who's the father of rocket science in our country from Worcester, went there for 10 years to do his research. And along with that research he did, Charles Lindbergh was the one who arranged the funding for that, and he did that through the Guggenheim family out on the West Coast. And what kind of makes it even more interesting is Donald Keogh, and people who are UFO aficionados will know that he was the one who began NICAP, the NICAP organization. And Donald Keogh was his companion for about 1 year and did a book on Charles Lindbergh. So he had a chance to talk to Charles Lindbergh. And at that time, Charles Lindbergh was traveling to Germany. And I have no doubt that he had a chance to interact with Werner von Braun and Herman Olberth, who were very much interested in UFOs and the rocket technology. Sadly,
Well, your book
the V2
is taking off from around the era of the Roswell incident. Is that where
Yes,
it
it
begins?
is. So, yeah, so this, I'm getting kind of more details in the background of that. So basically, the 509th, eventually in 1958 of August, they flew east, and they flew east up here to Portsmouth, to the Pease Air Force Base.
And they were out of Pease then, right?
And they were out of Pease. Yeah. They were the foundation at that level now of the newly formed Strategic Air Command.
Oh, okay.
And
you say late 50s.
50, yeah, they arrived in 1958 in August, and they founded the formation of that. And what we have by then now is the Cold War taking place. So those planes were long-range bombers, and they're ready to go, within 15 minutes and take off if need be. And their pathway was from Pease Air Force Base heading up through Canada. They had a base at Happy Valley in Goose Bay, Labrador, another one in Greenland, and then from there they would fly over in their American bases in England, of which the Rendlesham Forest, Brent Woods, later also famous in ufology, was part of the route. And
well, at what point were there nuclear weapons then at Pease?
There were nuclear weapons right from the get-go of that, Lynn. There were several things going on. There were the Minuteman missile systems that were being developed, but until those really came into play, the B-52s were the ones that had the nuclear armaments, and they were up in the air. They were developing the refueling planes that were also at Pease, and along with the 509th Bomb Wing was the 100th Bombardment Wing as well. And that was another very famous part of the Air Force.
Well, what's really interesting is that in 1958 they started settling at Pease, and then 1961, 65, we get a lot of sightings subsequent to them settling in Pease.
We do get
which seems kind of coincidental, doesn't it?
Well, hence now you've hit on the title. They came east, and they followed. The 509th came east, and the UFO experience came. Phenomenon came east with them. And I think it's also interesting to look at the same time in 1958 that the Swordfish, which I think was the second atomic submarine that was put into service in the U.S. Navy, was launched at the Kittery, at the Naval Shipyard in Kittery.
Was it?
So, yeah. And, there's a lot of undersea UFOs that people look at as well. So I think you kind of look at those two together as what was happening with things nuclear. And that's the other part of it.
So that might have been part of the draw, huh?
With things nuclear. Seemingly, if you kind of coordinate the stuff, and there's people who study this thing and graph it out, and that's what they can find, that there's a lot of UFO sightings around nuclear weapons facilities or Air Force bases of nuclear armaments,
And there's been a lot of sort of disarmament or the stoppage of the functioning of the silos, of the nuclear silos, and inexplicably so. It's happened often that the nuclear weapons were shut down, and it's suspected that it was by UFOs.
That's true, and somebody I've got to know quite well who was the first investigator at the incident of Exeter from NICAP, Raymond Fowler, who lives up in Kennebunk, worked in that field and documented quite a lot of that, and that's true.
Yeah, he was part of NICAP too, wasn't he?
And he was.
Yeah.
He was part of NICAP, and then when NICAP was kind of taken over, if you kind of read back into it, interestingly enough, by elements from the CIA, then Raymond jumped ship with a bunch of them, and they founded. He was an investigator for MUFON, and the New England director wrote the investigator's manual for ufology for MUFON as well. So,
are you planning on getting into Betty and Barney Hill and the incident at Exeter, as well as the Great Northeast Blackout? Is that part of your book?
That is part of it. It's all part of somewhat of a chain, because Betty and Barney inexplicably connected to
Yeah.
the 509th Bomb Wing. Not only did they have a lot of friends with the 509th Bomb Wing.
Oh,
but,
did they?
Oh, they did.
Mm.
And, very mysterious things because
Yeah.
in 1965, when the incident at Exeter took place in September.
September 3rd.
September 3rd.
Yeah.
Within a couple of months of that, in November. Now, one of
9th.
right, one of the people who investigated from Pease Air Force Base, Lieutenant Alan Brandt, who was a young public relations officer, and was down investigating as part of the team, the incident at Exeter. Within a couple of months, up at the Unitarian Church in Dover, he was hosting the Hills Coming Out party.
Oh,
just
really?
Just 2 months later. For them to come out, and it was a rainy night, I understand, and the 400 people or more showed up. They couldn't pack them all into the church. So how curious is that? You're somebody from Pease Air Force Base, the home of the 509th now, and they're, investigating the incident at Exeter, but all of a sudden the information of the Hills becomes public, and they come out to the public. And the person who broke the story, John Luttrell of the Boston Herald, who was a big-time writer at the time. He had written down in Rhode Island earlier on and broke stories of mob activities down in Providence and this and that. He's a big writer. But so he also was in the intelligence branch, a captain during World War II, fluent in German. And, I'm kind of getting here is a little bit of the Hills, particularly Betty, thought of these MyLab components, which is a military abduction component to some of the abduction phenomena. But in any event, later on you'll read where Betty Hill had said they felt betrayed that John Luttrell wrote these articles. But
at what point did he, before they came out publicly with everything?
So that was just within weeks of that. These articles, 5 articles came out in the Boston Herald. But later on I've seen a letter from Betty, thanking him for how he presented it and did it. And back in the letter, John Luttrell had stated that he was actually, the way he heard about what happened with Betty and Barney was from a couple of Pease Air Force officers at a cocktail party.
Really?
Yeah, it was. So, and Betty and Barney's one of their closest friends, who has been a treat for me to interview and be able to document and write about in the book, was a captain up there, Lieutenant. Well, at the time he was Captain Ben Sweat, and Kathy Martin's in Stan Friedman's book, you'll read about him and that. And when the story broke, and you read about Benny and Barney Hill seeking solace up to get away from the publicity in the press, they went up to Pease Air Force Base to the home of Captain Benjamin Sweat, who also happened to be stationed at Roswell. And he flew up in 1958, and I've had a chance to talk to him, and he had some very interesting conversations of old sergeants who was there in regard to Roswell. And so when the story broke, that's where the Hills sought solace, right on Pease Air Force Base, with an officer of the 509th who later went on to become a full colonel, work at the Pentagon, and retire after a distinguished career. Another interesting component is when Betty and Barney had finished their hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon, and I'll say Colonel Benjamin Simon.
Oh.
Was a colonel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, back
Another piece to the puzzle?
in World War II as well, and practiced narcosynthesis, so you can see a little bit where that may be going as well. But when the Hills got a hold of those tapes, they took them up to Captain Sweat's home, and Ben said that as they were listening to that, Barney became horrendously. It was so stressful, physically ill. He went to his sink and vomited and retched terribly. It was so emotional and an event to hear those tapes. So Betty and Barney Hill, through my research, were a wonderful couple, very much involved in the civil rights movement.
They were very civic-minded,
They
too,
were civic-minded.
both of them.
Barney was the head of the Rockingham Community Action, which means Head Start, when that was getting started in the war on poverty. They went to Lyndon Johnson's inaugural, so they were very active.
Oh, did they really?
Politically, yeah. And Barney was very active in civil rights. There's a little story you can read in their papers, which are up at the University of New Hampshire in the special collections, which I would recommend anybody go up. They had an afternoon to read through some of those. And in those are other things, like, for example, Barney in Portsmouth wanted to get a haircut.
What
And
happened?
So he went to several barbershops, but the first one that he went to, he said, "I will not cut your hair."
Oh,
And
no.
this is in Portsmouth in the mid-'60s, and I know how, being an old Yankee, how I would feel if I was told to be dismissed and they wouldn't cut my hair in the barbershop.
Very insulting.
It was very insulting, and it must have been very difficult, for Barney. And but the gentleman that he was, they were documenting how that was. So he left and then went to the next barber shop where they cut his hair immediately, and he said he got a very good haircut and it was very satisfactory.
Well, that's good.
Very sad.
we-
What were you going
we-
to say?
We have an email question.
Okay.
Oh, all right.
All right, going back a few minutes here, so before we get too far past it, this is from Dave in Houston, actually. He says, you hit on one of my favorite subjects, von Braun. Just how much were the Nazis involved with our space program? Von Braun seemed to have some knowledge of retro-engineered space technology. Can you tell us about that?
I can. So, Werner von Braun was very involved in our space program. Von, Baron von Braun, he was an aristocrat from Germany, and very privileged, grew up privileged. His rocket site, and I'm going to pronounce it probably wrong, but Paternoge in Germany, was a summer home where they used to go in summer and this and that. And unlike some of his other colleagues, he chose, to become an SS officer and support the Third Reich and continue to do his rocket research because that's what he wanted to do. And others like von Rothschild headed off to Vermont as the von Trapp family by train was able to escape to Vermont and get out of that situation. But
Funny how they want to come to the U.S., huh?
it was. But sadly, while the von Braun's vengeance rockets, the V-2, the word vengeance, rained down upon England, and but there was about 10,000 people documented that was slave labor, of which his brother was in charge of part of that, Magnus von Braun. And but when the war was ending, there was a big concern again with the Cold War with the Soviets who'd get these different rocket scientists and this and that. So they surrendered there up in the Alps, and they came down and surrendered to the U.S. troops, and they were whisked over here pretty quickly.
Was there some reverse engineering involved in his research?
Well, so the German research program, particularly people who kind of look into the ufology component kind of wonder if the Germans themselves had recovered, a potential alien craft.
Kind of sounds like it.
And did some reverse engineering as well. But Hermann Olberth, who was von Braun's mentor, who also came over here, was very much convinced, that we were being visited, by alien craft, and that von Braun had a huge interest in it as well. And now you've got Charles Lindbergh, who was down in Roswell with Goddard, going over to Germany. And later on, only in the last few years, it's come out that Charles Lindbergh sired, I think, 3 children by 2 different sisters over in Germany during that period. And so there's a lot of things beneath the surface that most of us get to see taking place with a very small group. So Werner von Braun ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, where he continued his interest in UFOs, and of course there began with his rocket research to be able to fire off the Saturn rockets, which were some of the first space rockets we had. At the same time, IBM was up to their necks, and kind of this stuff was coming down from New York with their engineers and doing the brains of it, mission control like that. So you had von Braun's rockets, and you had IBM, doing that. IBM had been involved over in Germany during World War II, doing data tracking for Hitler under a different guise as well. So, there's a lot of very select engineering groups, scientists, aristocratic peoples in that pulling into this. So von Braun was very much involved in it, and actually he might have very much been involved with an experiment that took place in 1967 out of Kingston, New Hampshire, with Betty and Barney Hill, some big players, Colonel Benjamin Simon, John Fuller, who wrote the Incident in Exeter book.
Well, what was the experiment?
Well, the experiment was to have contact with an alien craft that Betty felt that she could telepathically communicate with.
Okay.
But curiously, while the experiment was set up in Kingston, that part of it, the other part was being set up down in Huntsville, Alabama, at the same time, where von Braun and that crew was. And
what were they doing?
IBM
What was the
people.
connection?
Well, the connection was that Betty was going to contact the craft here
Okay.
and give a message, and then they had a listening station down in the Huntsville area that was going to pick it up.
Pick up her telepathic
pick up
message.
her telepathic message. And one of the words was moccasin that they were looking for to try to have heard down in Huntsville, Alabama. So they were really...
Did it work? Did that experiment work?
So that's interesting. So that experiment at that part didn't seem to work, except for the fact that there was a couple in Newton, New Hampshire that had contact, they felt, with a UFO that very night, where they could flash their flashlight, and answering in return were light signals back to their flashlight. And that case was investigated by none other than Raymond Fowler, who documented it. So it was very curious that was taking place in Newton, New Hampshire, which is like a town away from Kingston, right?
Yeah.
The very night that they were set up for this other experiment with the big players, Jacques Vallée, John Fuller, who wrote the Incident Exeter book and a number of other books, and Dr. Benjamin Simon, Betty and Barney, and a whole group of people, including some other mysterious people from IBM that were there, by the way, engineers.
So, was the experiment successful? In Alabama, did they pick up anything?
They did not in Alabama. There was some signals in New York in an area out by this Lake Desolation that the IBM people felt was kind of curious and interesting as well. But
did Betty feel that she made contact?
Well, Betty kind of would focus on, Betty focused on the fact that she felt the contact that she was trying to have take place did take place over Newton.
Oh, over Newton?
With Newton, New Hampshire, with that couple who Raymond Fowler had gone and documented as well. So
did she have any satisfaction in transmitting the word moccasin?
Again, Lynn, it was picked up, at this Lake Desolation in New York with a group of people out into there.
Okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't quite where she was directing it. It was kind of,
she was close. New York, Alabama.
Well, but the part over Newton, New Hampshire was kind of fascinating.
Yeah,
because
I
these
hadn't
people
heard
had
that.
signaled the UFO craft that they saw, and their signals were returned, and Raymond Fowler documented all of it the very same night of it. So,
that's
it's
very
just
interesting.
but it really is about the information, the technology, the communication, and that's what they were working on. And all the big players came in. Carl Sagan, everybody was interested.
Carl Sagan was involved too.
Well, not in that particular part of it, but everybody was involved in Betty and Barney in their story. They came to see them, they came to interview them, and spent a lot of time with them. Yeah.
Well, in working on your book, I know that you've done a lot of historical research, and you did mention that back in the 17th century, here in the New England area, particularly Massachusetts, there was some contact made with UFOs back then with a Mr. Averill. So I was hoping maybe you could enlighten the audience about that, because that's not well known.
It is not, Lynn, and I think this is, for a researcher like myself in history, this, when I discovered this, and it's kind of been out there, but it just was...
It's a nice nugget of information, isn't it?
It's a great nugget, because it took place about 8 years after the Puritans had landed in Salem, Mass. And I think that at the time I was talking to a buddy of mine in Stratham, Peter Wiggin, and Peter Wiggin is descended from Captain Thomas Wiggin, we call him is New Hampshire's first governor. He was a magistrate for some patent holders.
Yeah, our first settlers.
Our first settlers, yeah. So what was kind of interesting, Governor John Winthrop wrote a bunch of journals over a number of years, which is great, because a lot of times you don't have those historic documents from those years. His son, John Winthrop Jr., by the way, is extremely interesting because he was an alchemist, traveled around through the Middle East. Yeah, an alchemist.
I mean, he admitted it?
Oh, he did admit it, and he was different than Dad. They support each other as a father and son might, but he's completely different than Dad, the rigid Puritan.
Yeah.
And John Winthrop Jr. founded the state of Connecticut, one of the two states like Massachusetts that derives from an Algonquin language name, a Native American name, and was going to have a state of alchemy. That was his hope to have that there. But getting back to his dad, John Winthrop, so he kept these journals, and in 1639, he was writing to, or he's making a note in his journal to Captain Thomas Wiggin, Pete's generational ancestor, about 14 generations back, and he was chastising him for helping the Reverend John Wheelwright settle in Exeter, where they found a plantation. Well, so basically, when the Puritans banished people like Roger Williams, who was who was considered the first Baptist in America, Anne Hutchinson, who was a very noted woman who was a nonconformist. That was kind of what they called them, and they were banished to the wilderness. And basically,
because they weren't Congregationalists or Puritans or whatever.
Because they were nonconformists, and the
becoming
term
Baptists.
they had. Well, in Roger Williams' case, he was considered a Baptist. In the case of Anne Hutchinson and her brother-in-law John, the Reverend John Wheelwright, they were considered antinomians.
Oh,
And that was the term for that. But there were Quakers in the area as well, and the Quakers were very much persecuted too. So,
okay.
So when these people were thrown out of the church and banished, you think of what it was like back then. They were banished, to the wilderness. And Roger Williams was taken in by Mianatonomo and Kennichet, two of the great historic Narragansett chiefs, where he found shelter for the winter, and so he was okay. The Reverend Wheelwright came up to Exeter, where he also purchased some land from the Native Americans, the Pennacook peoples up in this area, and went to settle in. But coming to the wilderness with nothing, he needed some shelter and food and different supplies. So Captain Tom and another man, Hilton, who was another one of the proprietors, helped them out. So basically. The Reverend, Winthrop was chastising Captain Tom for helping him out. And in the middle of this, it really sticks out like a sore thumb. And I was actually hopeful you'd ask about this tonight. So I really had brought it up, the actual quote, because I like to see the primary quote right out of the journal, because you'll see it out there on the internet, but people have kind of massaged it and changed it a bit. And this is what it said. It said, and this is 1638, in this year, one James Everell, a sober, discreet man, and two others saw a great light in the night at Muddy River. When it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square. When it ran, it was contracted in the figure of a swine. It ran as swift as an arrow towards Charlestown. And so up and down about 2 or 3 hours. They were come down in their lighter about a mile, and when it was over, they found themselves carried quite back against the tide to the place they came from. Diverse other credible persons saw the same light after at about the same place. So you have some different things going on here, but one of the first things you'd notice, not only did they see this light, this unidentified aerial light, the UAP. In Europe, they often say more UAPs than UFOs.
Oh, do they really?
Unidentified, UALs, I'm sorry, but unidentified aerial lights, unidentified aerial phenomena. So they saw this light. It's interesting to me, having done a lot of research on listening to people of what they do see for UFOs, it was in the shape of a swine.
What do they mean by that?
So in those days, the pigs were very long and lean. Pilgrims brought pigs over, and they were noted for that long and lean shape. And so it's somewhat of a dirigible shape, which is one of the classic shapes that people see those lights in. But perhaps even the most amazing and interesting part, and James Everett was very interesting. He was a member of the church. He was a selectman. He was the head of the Temperance Society for the Puritans, so you can imagine how straight and narrow this guy was, and it's just like today when we look to say often whether it's policemen of the Air Force or people who kind of know what craft look like are the ones giving the description. Winthrop says a sober, discreet man, and but to me the most interesting part. So the lighter was a boat. James Everell dealt in hides. He was a shoemaker, but more than just a shoemaker. He had a pretty good-sized business of making shoes in Boston. And Muddy River comes into the Charles River about where MIT is.
Oh.
And it's hard to picture it today because back then there were 7 islands. It was an estuary. It was a back bay.
Yeah.
It's been dredged up, I'm sure, since then.
Oh, yeah. It was filled in 24/7 for years. Eventually, Muddy River got so narrow and that it actually became a sewer cesspool. And later, I'm trying to think of the architect that came in, but it's now called the Emerald Necklace. A very famous architect came in for Boston and redid it. There's a lot of universities along there. So if anybody was in by the Charles and saw where the Muddy River came, it's a little different to picture how this boat would have floated in and out. But what it did do is they found themselves 2 or 3 hours later back up against the tide where they began. So how does a boat come back up against the tide? We're kind of talking what people would say, like Raymond Fowler of the Allagash abductions, is a classic 2 to 3 hour missing time abduction scenario.
A big mystery.
Is.
Dean, hold on if you would just a moment. We're at the
Sure.
bottom of the hour, so we're going to take a quick break, and we're speaking with Dean Merchant. He is an historical UFO researcher, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes, so don't go anywhere.
And I just want to mention, too, that the phone lines are open tonight. So if anybody wants to call and ask Dean a question, 603-430-9722. And we'll be right back.
Supernatural Magazine, the UK's newest paranormal magazine, provides support to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. It is the magazine's goal to bring every aspect of supernatural news and research from around the world under one roof to create a universal platform for all those interested in the supernatural. More information is available at supernaturalmagazine.com. You are listening to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience on WSCA 106.1 FM, and we'll be right back after this short break.
You are listening to WSCA 106.1 FM in Portsmouth's West End. And from the community calendar, River Run Books welcomes acclaimed author Monica Woods on Thursday night, April 14th at 6:30 p.m. Woods, author of When We Were Kennedys and Any Better Things, will read from her latest novel entitled The 1 in a Million Boy, the story of a 104-year-old woman and the young sweet boy who was assigned to take care of her. This is a free event, and there will be a book signing preceding the reading. For more information, call 603-431-2100 or email riverrunbookstore.com. The River Run Bookstore is located at 142 Fleet Street in Portsmouth, and we have some upcoming guests.
Well, our upcoming guest list starts with April 16th. The crash in Roswell of July of 1947 was not the only UFO crash in history. There have been others, although not widely publicized until now. One of these known crashes took place in Aztec, New Mexico in March of 1948. Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, authors of the Aztec UFO Incident, will be our guests to discuss their extensive research on the matter. And I might add that they were just on Coast to Coast on December 26, 2015. April 23rd, The Empath's Quest is the latest release of the Reverends Betty Comerford and Steve Wilson, and these are two psychic, caring, and spiritual people who lend their guidance to those who find themselves overwhelmed by the emotions of others. April 30th, the quintessential lighthouse historian Jeremy D'Entremont will join us once again to wrap up the tales and histories of his West Coast lighthouse tour a few months ago. On May 7th, we're welcoming back Joni Mahan, and she has written a book on the Victorian Mansion in Gardner, Massachusetts, and she'll be returning to talk about her new release titled Devil's Toy Box. May 14th, we have a new topic to explore in Spirit Radio, and that would be Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Kelly and Kawani Lapsaritis will be our guests, and they have had extensive encounters with both ETs and Sasquatch. And May 21st, now that we've rebooked Michelle Matuzas, her tarot deck is finally being released, and Michelle is a psychic medium empath who is also an historic reenactor and a member of the Spirit Light Network, and she's also an artist. And this deck of tarot cards that she's releasing display all of her own artwork. And that, for the time being, wraps up our upcoming guest list.
Okay, well, let's go back then to our in-studio guest tonight, local UFO researcher, Dean Merchant. Welcome back, Dean.
Welcome back, Dean.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, and just to kind of look a little bit more at that Everell sighting, how amazing it was of his two companions out on the Muddy River. That it does have all the classic things of not only a great UFO sighting, but an abduction as well. And when Winthrop wrote about this in his journal, he had been chastising Peter Wiggins' ancestor, Captain Thomas Wiggin, New Hampshire's first governor, about helping Reverend Wheelwright get established in the town of Exeter, which has become kind of the mecca and enigma for UFO sightings over time. And this sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, the Everell sighting. I've kind of wanted to get down to Harvard University and find out where the original journal is kept. I mean, it may be also in New York to actually see it there because it's so astounding. But he did his journals, and there were other comments he made, other observations and records he made of UFO sightings. There was another one not too many years later that he wrote about taking place on a September 11th entry, and it read, "It being court time, about 7 or 8 in the evening, there appeared to the southward a great light, about 30 or 40 feet in length. It went very swift and continued for about 1 minute. It was observed by many in the bay," meaning the Bay State, "and at Plymouth, where the Pilgrims were, and New Haven in Connecticut, and it seemed to be all in the same position." So, he noted, some of these other sightings of mysterious lights and that, and then throughout early New England history, down in Gloucester, Massachusetts, at Deerfield, before one of the famous native Indian attacks on Deerfield, one of the Indian Wars, they mentioned, seeing little beings in silver suits that move quickly through the woods behind the trees.
Really?
Yeah. Little beings in silver suits.
Was this before the massacre in Deerfield?
It was. It was before the massacre, and things get very, very dark. If you look back to the records of that, the sky turned completely black, and one kind of wonders if it portended, some event that was to come like that by observers that were, somehow kind of aware of what might be taking place. But, somewhat this type of thing I find, of the smaller, say like a 3 to 4 foot entity in a silver suit has continued. A woman I know, was a friend, Ann Bragg, who's retired now, but she was the librarian up in Errol, New Hampshire, was coming down through Jefferson, New Hampshire one night, and Jackson, New Hampshire one night. I was thinking, because it used to be Adams, but when Andrew Jackson became president, the people liked him, so they voted to change it from Adams to Jackson. But it's a beautiful little town with a covered bridge and a golf course, and she was coming through, and she saw on either side 6 to 8, 4 foot. She thought at first they were children, but they weren't children. It was like in November out on the golf course, pretty cold, and they were in these little shiny silver suits. So this is kind of a form that people do see from time to time in New England over a long period of time.
Getting back to the lights that they saw in the 17th century, in any of the documentation, was there some reasoning or explanation as to what these lights were? Did they think it was the work of the devil? Was there any speculation on what they were?
So that's interesting, Lynn, because somebody several hundred years later, in writing a book on Winthrop, did speculate that. But no, these, because later on, as you know, before that century ended, there was the witchcraft trials and a lot of this other parts of that. But there was none of that in any of these descriptions. They were just basically stated as they were. You kind of wish that people did, more journals and stuff back then to see about that. When I see it in 1638, I mean, the Pilgrims landed in 1620, and previous to that, for 10 to 12,000 years basically. But the Algonquin peoples had lived their lives for a long period of time, but sadly in 1616 there was a pandemic that hit within 2 years. 90% of the coastal Indians had passed, and with them all of their storytellers. So we don't have access to those thousands and thousands of years of that history. And I had in Stratham, I had a Native American ancestor, grandmother Lilliquam Critchard, who lived in town in the 1660s, 1670s, who was a survivor. Her direct ancestors of that horrible pandemic, but. You do wish, kind of, in some way, you could go back and interact with your ancient ancestors like that.
Did you find anything else in your research subsequent to these sightings in the 17th century? Anything maybe 1800s that came along?
Yep, there are those still a little bit different, but but coming along all the same. With different incidents of sightings and that. So it's. Not quite as interesting as the 1638 one that
was so well documented
with the missing time and the time frame with that. As I say, it dovetails Ray Fowler's work and stuff many years later.
That's an essential element, the missing time. That's amazing.
It is amazing, but I think what really interests me too is the focus on Exeter, because from there on out, And I think, we've talked about this before, that, well, as an historian, what do you look at? And why would the UFO phenomenon, or, why would there be that focus on Exeter? And I kind of look at it as a working model, the watering hole theory, because there's so much history has taken place in Exeter from that 1638 time. It was a revolutionary capital. Later it became, the home to Phillips Exeter Academy, and I write about that in the book because there's a lot of very interesting stuff tied into the UFO phenomena and Phillips Exeter Academy and their grounds. And
But isn't that just kind of, I don't know, almost, well, what do you think the cause is behind the connection with the Academy?
Right. So I think, again, that watering hole theory, if you kind of use an observation as to where a lot of the Academy people ended up going, on to their careers. So it was basically a grooming school for Harvard University in its early years, while Phillips Andover was a grooming school for people going to Yale.
But I'm talking about the sightings, Dean. Why do you suppose the
Right, so
sightings
I'm kind of getting into that in the observation as to why. Well, part of that. So the incident at Exeter took place in Kensington, but the craft arose on land that was Phillips Exeter Academy land. So you've got several things. The land is very, very isolated out there, and it's swampy. There's power lines going through it. So people are very interested, in the fact that they've seen, particularly like in Brentwood, New Hampshire, observations of these long silver feeding tubes seemingly coming up to the power lines that. So you've got that isolation. You've got I call it the atomic triangle. I know kind of the triangle like it's overused, but you have Pease Air Force Base, the Nuclear Navy Yard, and in 1968, when they were out kind of mapping out where the Seabrook nuclear power plant was going to go as well, and UFOs are seen over nuclear power plants every much as missile sites. In fact, documented on the internet, those craft they thought lowered the radiation on one of the units in Chernobyl, Unit 2, like that. A lot of people saw that, and we can find that out on the internet. So, so there's a lot of interesting reasons as to why that is. But historically, Exeter is just crucial in our American history in a microcosm. And right from Abraham Lincoln speaking there in 1861, the Republican Party was founded on the corner of Court Street
Well, how about some of the specifics of the sightings that happened a little bit more in our later history in Stratham, for example, like the 1960s and 70s? You had mentioned Doug Scammon. There was a sighting on his farm property.
There was in the 1960s. It was quite well known at the time, and I'm kind of anxious if anybody has any direct information to that or relatives and stuff to find out more about it. But it was a UFO had apparently landed on his farm, which is at the corner of River Road and Portsmouth Avenue in Stratham. And at the time, it was well talked about and one of the major sightings that took place. And
well, let me ask you, one of the other ones, this one was on the corner of, I'm checking my notes here, Holgram Road, just off of Bunker Hill Road, and the kids were out there sledding.
Correct.
And then somehow people from the government came and interrogated them, one being John Oswald. Is that correct?
That
from
is
NICAP?
correct, right.
And Oswald seemed to be anticipating their answers, and then he admitted that, yes, there had been some kind of mechanical measurement devices in the fields that had something to do with electromagnetism that perceived the UFOs coming. So do you know anything about that?
I do. So there's a little crossover in two cases. So there's the case that took place on the Bunker Hill Road at Bob Wiggins' potato field, where the children saw a UFO landing and panicked and went home. There were marks in the snow, and the Air Force came out and investigated that. There was also another sighting, though, over in a sand pit, which was also over on Bunker Hill Road with three boys.
Oh, there's a sand pit there.
And a sand pit.
Or there was,
and they had ridden their snow machines through there and saw a large UFO in the sand pit and had panicked. And that was the particular one that John, I think was mentioned, that John Oswald, who worked under Raymond Fowler at the time for NICAP and then moved on.
He worked under him?
He did.
I didn't realize that.
He was a field agent for both Raymond Fowler and David Webb of the Webb brothers, who were very famous down in Massachusetts, Walter and David Webb. So he did the documentation. He actually is a single gentleman who moved here and has spent his whole life researching UFOs, not long after he got his master's degree in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin. And he and David Webb worked on something called the MADAR project, and that was these triggers that would be triggered off of a device with an electromagnetic field if a craft went by. So if there was a sighting, like there was the one in Stratham that day in the gravel pit off of Bunker Hill, where the tennis courts and the soccer fields are now actually located in town, it would trip that device. So that would be a confirmation, sort of like the smoking gun people always talk about.
Well, when were those
like radar.
planted?
And those were in the 1960s. So this was kind of a very high-tech scientific
Very
project,
secretive.
a
It had
simple
to have been.
device back then that they were working on to try to get corroborative evidence,
Corroborate, yep.
for these type of things that took place. And in this case, the device that they had in the area was tripped off.
So apparently there were only about 13 of them that they had placed. Is that right? And it wasn't certainly all in Stratham.
Right. It was a wider project than that.
Across the state of
MADAR
New Hampshire.
project. But if you look up MADAR and they Google that up, they'll find a lot of information about it. And it was a pretty neat, kind of way of doing that.
It's an acronym that stands for Multiple Anomaly Detection and Automated Recording.
Well, there you have it, Lynn.
Yeah,
right there.
magnetic,
Yeah. Neat,
electric,
right?
electromagnetic
Yeah, there it is,
anomalies. I had never heard of that, and I didn't realize that the government was really even looking into that about the detecting the sightings. I didn't realize that it was that much of an issue. I thought it was more
that was
haphazard.
a private organization, though, right?
Oh, was
ICAP
it? Oh,
yeah,
I
they were
see.
doing it, and there's a picture of the device, a drawing of it, and I think which were Raymond Fowler's books, but I think it might have been his first book, Interplanetary Visitors, in the back of the book, and he notes the device and mentions John Oswald in the book.
Sounds very sneaky to me.
It sounds government, doesn't it?
It sounds government, but on the other hand, there's an organization, right in this area called Citizens Within a 10-Mile Radius, and they have nuclear radiation monitors set up because they're checking on the nuclear power plant for citizens, show that it's an independent.
Well, good.
It is good, and I think some of this with NICAP was doing the same thing. They wanted to collect, their own information, so they weren't part of the they, and that's when you're a historian. You're always trying to kind of track down, who, when people say the they is, well, who the they are.
Yeah.
When I,
Yeah.
when I
Who
was
is
in the
it?
legislature, I felt, every bill should have every lobbyist and everybody who had a part in it, the committee hearings, their name should be attached so you can come back and check it. But I think that, so I was in at one time when Doug Scamm was Speaker of the House. So I've had a chance to ask Doug, his feeling about extraterrestrials, and it's a big galaxy, and he just feels, that's a part of the galaxy's reality. One of the surprise things, though, that I came across recently at a Kiwanis breakfast meeting was talking to Russ Prescott, who is a senator from Exeter who is running for executive council right now. And when Russ was a lad, I want to say around 12 years old, living in Exeter, there was a report. They heard that a UFO had landed on a field. So they got on their bikes the next day and rode over, kind of expecting to see nothing. And Russ said, guess what? You could see some very interesting imprints in the field like that. So, so was it a unique craft tied into the 509th bombing in Pease? I mean, you and I, Lynn, have talked about the famous crash of the B-52 in the Fremont Swamp in 1959, where a B-52 blew up over that swamp and not far from a house, the Jalbert home, written about by John Fuller, where there were many, many UFO sightings, as if they were coming and looking for somebody missing in action with that.
Well, what do you suppose? You think that was the attraction for the flybys over Fremont and Raymond?
Well, again, I think part of that attraction for the flybys, again, speculating, as an historian, is the fact that the Exeter River winds its way all the way up through there. So there's something seemingly significant from the head of the falls that have been settled in the colonial times and coming up through that whole Exeter River region. And as you know, over in Kingston, we could talk about some of the sightings there as well, and East Kingston, Kensington, all of that whole area. And
But why do you suppose there's a connection with the river?
About 3 minutes left.
oh, okay. Well, I'm going to be kind of writing quite a bit about the significance of that as well.
Can you give us a hint?
I do think that Shaw's Hill, and some very well-known people think Shaw's Hill in Kensington, which is above the river, is a UFO window or portal where craft come and go.
Now, see, I've never heard that angle.
Come and go. People have been by there at night, and they actually look out and see the whole field lit up. This is part of the phenomenon as well, and they've seen UFOs coming and going there. So I kind of look at Exeter as a port. And, we have Logan Airport or, different airports. You don't change them over time, right? You kind of got your destination, you're coming in, it's focused, and this is where you come. And Exeter is very, very especially unique in many, many ways, along with the power lines, the isolation, Pease Air Force Base, the 509th Bomb Wing. There's just a huge amount. And Betty Hill grew up in Kingston, not far from there. And, it's just, and for example, Butch Blanchard, to get this into Roswell fame, Colonel Blanchard, spent his PE, his postgraduate year before he went on to the military academy at Phillips Exeter Academy. If you look back to James Everell's history, one of his daughters, Hannah, married a William Blanchard of Boston. I haven't kind of checked in on that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised the way these things play out if, in fact, that General Butch Blanchard, Colonel Blanchard of Roswell fame, was, in fact, maybe descended from those Blanchards in Boston and the Everell family. So there's just, wherever you turn, there's so much cool stuff. There's connections everywhere. And you're connecting the dots and picking puzzle pieces up, and hopefully, I think, to get a corner piece or a straight line edge piece here and there.
How did you come up with the idea of a portal over Shaw's Hill or in that area? What brought you to that?
Well, you go right back to the incident at Exeter, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary, that book that came out 50 years ago. And there's several incidents mentioned in there. I had talked to Phil Imbrogno, who was an author who wrote a number of books as well. Phil felt there was a UFO window there. But I've also interviewed current-day people as well, and they've had independently these same experiences of seeing UFOs land on this flat field there up at Shaw's Hill. It's not far from where the incident took place. I found another couple that saw the same thing Norman Muscarello and the police did at 10 o'clock at night. So this is kind of an ongoing event in collecting with dozens of people. So it's not just a small group. Dozens and dozens of people saw that and experienced that, the thing back then. So there's just,
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that angle. Okay, that's neat.
It's a neat
look into
thing,
that some more.
Yeah.
Boy, we really look forward to reading They Flew East.
Yeah, I kind of jabbering away. I'm looking over at Willie here and his smile and that. But I do kind of do that. I kind of wish I had another hour I could keep going on because it's
you
fun.
Just have to come back again.
But
the hours do go.
But they do go
fast.
by quickly.
Yeah.
So I guess it's time for Molly,
How about
Dog, and I to kind of get ready to depart. But
any release date?
Any release date
on the book yet? Or
well, I want to get it finished up in the next few months because not only is it the 50th anniversary, but it's the 50th anniversary of the congressional hearings. I would recommend anybody go to Jerry Ford's presidential library, read about Jerry Ford calling for those hearings. The incident at Exeter was the centerpiece of those hearings, Raymond Fallon's testimony. So, absolutely go look that up because it's really nice, neat.
Okay, well, we'll just keep us surprised if you
I
release
will. Well,
date,
thanks for having me.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Do you have anything coming up? Any events or anything you want to plug?
Well, I do. I do want to plug the Exeter Kiwanis. Again, all the money going to charity. You're going to have a 2-day festival coming up here on Labor Day weekend. And I do know Richard Dolan's coming back.
Fabulous.
And Richard's been up with us for 5 years now, and he's going to be the master of ceremonies and speak. So
Great
when
speaker.
it's based around that, it can't get better than that, can it? So I hope everybody can come for that and raise money for the kids, yeah.
All right. And I believe you're also speaking at KRI next month, are you not?
I don't quite think I'm lined up for that one, but I will
Whoops.
continue to go to those and recommend that people do go to the Seacoast Saucer meetups.
It's a fundraiser.
In Stratham,
This one in May.
No, that's great.
A fundraiser for the UFO Festival.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes,
well, then I'll definitely somehow find my way down to that.
All
if not
right.
speaking
We'll
to that
see you
as well.
there.
So, yeah, thank you both.
Okay, Dean.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And that is Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience, and Craig Mosier is coming right up with the Graveyard Shift.
And thanks again for listening. Good night.